World News Today, brought to you by Admiral Corporation with shortwave broadcasts direct from important overseas stations and reports from the leading news points in our own country, where CBS reporters are waiting to bring you first-hand news. Now, here is Bob Trout.
The president was buried today. The service at Hyde Park was simple, as the service yesterday in the White House had been. At 10 o'clock, the 4 guns began to boom, 21 times, the presidential salute. 45 minutes later, the bugler sounded taps. Now even the muffled drums are quiet. The president had gone home. The time for tears had ended, and the time for strength and fresh resolution had come. We take you now to Hyde Park, Tris Coffin reporting.
I stood by the grave in the bright sunlight of a cool spring morning as the last mortal remains of Franklin Delano Roosevelt were laid at rest. The plaintive notes of taps rang out over a hushed gathering of relatives, friends, and officials at the Roosevelt family estate. The services were held in the T-shaped garden only a few yards from the president's study. A high hedge shielded the burial. The rose bushes laid out in neat plots were in bud. Clusters of violets spotted the carpet of green lawn. The sky overhead was clear blue. The gathering was small and hushed by mutual understanding. There were many famous faces, but they were all blurred by the common denominators of solemnness and sorrow. Mrs. Roosevelt and Anna Roosevelt Bodiger were dressed in black. They stood with General Elliott Roosevelt. President and Mrs. Truman were with Mr. Roosevelt's intimate advisor, Justice Burns. I saw many old friends of the president: Jim Farley, Steve Early, Bernard Baruch, the cabinet, military high command, Supreme Court, and members of Congress. Mrs. James Roosevelt, the elderly cousin of the president, sat in a chair on the lawn. At her feet in the warm sunlight was Fala, Mr. Roosevelt's dog. The services began with the firing of a 21-gun salute. The only sound in the 10-second intervals between salvos was the chirping of a thrush high in the trees. In the distance, I heard the mournful sound of muffled drums. The coffin and its military escort were moving down the road. The band began to softly play the sad, majestic strains of Massenet's elegy. A child cried at this strange music. Through a gate in the hedge, I saw the Guard of Honor from West Point, young, sober faces, marching in slow, measured steps. The band changed to the Star-Spangled Banner, and then the soft, comforting chords of Nearer, My God, to Thee. The coffin was borne in by soldiers, preceded by a choir boy holding a golden crucifix. The Reverend W. George Anthony, rector of the Episcopal Church at Hyde Park, read the burial services. His snow-white hair was blown by the wind. His words at times were carried away. I heard these snatches. I heard a voice from heaven, Our Father who art in heaven, grant him entrance into the land of light and joy. We give thee hearty thanks for the good example of thy servants. Dust to dust and earth to earth. The voice ceased. 11 cadets from West Point pointed their rifles into the air and fired 3 volleys. The crash of sound echoed for seconds. The flag was removed from the coffin and handed to Mrs. Roosevelt. The coffin was lowered gently into the ground. Franklin Roosevelt was at rest in his beloved gardens. The thrush was singing again. I return you to New York.
12 days ago, CBS correspondent Eric Sevareid was in Germany with the American Ninth Army as it crossed the Rhine. He returned to Paris and then London and has just arrived in this country. Now he has been assigned to San Francisco to cover the United Nations conference. The war correspondent will become a peace correspondent. Now for his first report since returning to this country, here is Eric Sevareid.
On the big transatlantic airplane, we were who Americans did not dream that this would be our homecoming from the war. In the war, you think about your country a very great deal. A strong, simple picture takes form in your mind. The minor tones fade out, and you see your home country as a resolute place, such a confident and happy place. Perhaps that is because you feel all around you in Europe uncertainty and that undercurrent of fear about the future. In Germany a few days ago, the soldiers seemed almost happy in the war. It was going so well and so fast. You could see that they knew the eyes of their homeland were fixed upon them. They knew their home was happy and proud over their achievement. And they had that inner contentment of knowing that because of what they were doing, all was serene and safe with their people at home. Nothing could happen there. So now the soldiers must feel a little bit cheated in their victory. It is a little like the young boy who makes his first touchdown and then discovers his father was not in the audience. They will go on, of course. But if they hoist soon the American flag over Berlin, it will stop at half-mast, and that is not the same. And yet, you know, it is almost more appropriate this way. The flags of all the civilized people of Europe have been at half-mast for years. Few of them will have much sense of victory when it comes. They will have the sense of great relief, but the cost in sorrow remains in their hearts. American soldiers now will have a little more in common with their comrades of other lands. When we boarded the gleaming airplane in the warm Scottish night, we had heard only rumors that the president was dead, a thing the mind just could not accept. As we settled down across the waste of Iceland, we peered through the little round windows. There was a thin curtain of driving snowflakes, and through it we could see the American flag whipping and jerking in its unaccustomed place halfway up the pole. One didn't know quite what to expect as we neared the American coast. If all the land had been dark, we would not have been surprised. But the great seaboard cities sparkled and gleamed like tangled skeins of diamonds. There were Frenchmen and Dutch aboard going to Frisco. They rushed to the windows and caught their breath. The first bright, brave lights they had seen in 6 long years. And they had to come to America to see them. That wonderful face and voice which had expressed America to all Europe was gone. But the thing itself was still there. The substance was there. America, that is to say, the future, was there.
And now for a report from the American 12th Army Group headquarters, we take you to Germany. Bill Shadell reporting.
Seconds. Woo. Yesterday, I returned from a 3-day tour of the Third Army Front. As a sample of the vast area already occupied and the speed and scope of our advance, CBS European Chief Edward R. Murrow and I traveled 600 miles in 48 hours just to see one small portion of the front. That was from the nearest reliable transmitter to the front and return. It included a visit to Weimar, which had surrendered only a few hours previously, a along with the infantry, a tour of Buchenwald, one of Germany's 4 largest concentration camps, and an attempt to catch up with one of those spearheads of the 4th Armored Division. I will attempt to describe for you the scenes at Buchenwald. If you heard Mr. Murrow's broadcast an hour ago, you'll have some idea of the guilt which lies heavily on the heads of the German people. I can only say that Mr. Murrow used considerable restraint in his description of the horror, the indescribable misery concentrated there. Jena was a typical Concord city with the usual confusion. The doughboys going from house to house removing any possible snipers, the civilians complying with the order to turn in all weapons, others just curiously watching the flow of American tanks, half-tracks, jeeps through the streets. And everywhere the other nationalities, Czechs, Poles, Russians, French, jubilant over their newly won freedom. There was a very laughable scene going on in Weimar. These people, slaves, deprived of everything but fair food for existence and work, had found the freight yards, a few boxcars filled with clothing. They had swarmed over these cars, dragging out German uniforms, civilian suits, bolts of cloth, and, of course, were arguing over it. The arguments were settled mainly by force, though not seriously, so long as no German was involved. And the Germans knew better than to argue with their former slaves. And why shouldn't they lose? The wonder to me is that there is so little of it. It's small payment for long years of servitude and deprivation in a land that appears to have had its ill-gotten plenty, but denied it to all but the master race. This is Bill Shadell at General Bradley's headquarters, returning you now to Admiral in New York.
For a summary of developments on the Western Front as well as in France, we take you now to Paris. Charles Collingwood reporting.
Here in Paris, this too is a solemn day of mourning and memorial services for President Roosevelt. General de Gaulle, his cabinet, the diplomatic corps, and a host of Allied soldiers and French civilians went to Notre Dame today to honor the memory of a great man. All the dignitaries were present, but the greatest tribute was from the thousands of simple, ordinary folk who were there because they had lost someone they loved. The German army today is pulling itself together again for another last-ditch stand. On the Berlin front, they have forced us to give up one bridgehead across the Elbe River near Magdeburg.
In the north, they're establishing a line to hold the British and Canadians away from the North Sea and the ports of Emden, Bremen, and Hamburg. In the south, they are fighting the First Army off from Leipzig. Only the Third Army has been able to press on at its usual blitzkrieg pace. The Third Army is within 13 miles of the Czech frontier now, and they're within 7 miles of the big communication center of Chemnitz. Although the Ninth Army has lost one of its bridgeheads across the Elbe, there is still another one further south from Magdeburg, which is all right, and is, in fact, continually expanding. The rest of the Ninth Army is closing up to the line of the river due east of Berlin. Back in the Ruhr pocket, those parts of the First and Ninth Armies left to deal with it have joined and split the pocket in two. Incidentally, since we closed that pocket at the beginning of the month, we have taken 143,000 prisoners out of it, and they're still coming. Speaking of prisoners, we've taken nearly 550,000 this month alone. Yesterday was the biggest day of all, when we counted well over 90,000. Operations began this morning to clear the German pockets from the mouth of the Gironde River and thus free the great port of Bordeaux. Yesterday and today, this was the target of 2,300 American heavy bombers, and it's also being bombarded by a big task force of the French Navy. We hold Bordeaux, but we can't get in there as long as the Germans control the river mouth. Bordeaux is the least damaged of the big French ports, and we should be able to use it as soon as we can get in. In an order of the day to the French Army, American artillery, and FFI engaged, the French commander, General de Larmenat, said, "You are fighting to free the port so that France will have enough to eat this winter." This is Charles Collingwood in Paris, returning you to Admiral in New York.
And now for a summary of the news in Britain, we take you to London. Larry Lasser reporting.
The flags flew at half-mast over another Hyde Park today. Here in London's Hyde Park, the crowd sauntered past the soapbox speakers, and thousands of them paused to listen in the April spring weather to eulogies of the late president. And groups of young American soldiers in wax gathered in small knots here and there among the throngs of Britishers and talked about the only president most of them have ever known, and then about their new commander-in-chief. Already there's a growing feeling of confidence in Britain over President Truman. All Britain was asking the question, what happens now? And they got one of the answers in President Truman's request to Moscow that Foreign Commissar Molotov attend the San Francisco conference. Premier Stalin's ready agreement has lifted the heart of Britain. They are heartened here by their sensing that President Truman has already taken a sure grip on the reins. And now that feeling of international loneliness is passing. They know now that the great three-power understanding, accomplished only through the blood and tears of war, is not to be lost in a day because of the death of one of its leading spirits. From Britain today, another armada of American fortresses and liberators made the long flight to Bordeaux on the Bay of Biscay. 1,300 of these unescorted heavy bombers battered the Germans in the Gironde pocket for the second day running. They were assisting the long-awaited sea and air attack to free the French port. French troops began the assault on the ground, while French warships bombarded German strongpoints at the mouth of the Gironde. Today, the American heavy bombers used a new and terrible bomb for the first time. It's a specially constructed firebomb containing a highly inflammable liquid. A detonator explodes each container as it hits the ground, scattering the flaming liquid over a 60-yard area. Today, the fortresses and liberators showered more than 460,000 gallons of flaming liquid on gun positions, trenches, and pillboxes, as well as high explosive bombs on the German guns on both sides of the Gironde estuary. These new fire liquid bombs may go a long way towards bringing the European war to a quicker end. If any German pockets continue to hold out after we have proclaimed VE Day, the holdout Germans may expect the threat of being burnt alive. The British Second Army captured a field marshal today. It was Field Marshal von Mackensen, 96-year-old retired veteran of the last war. They expected him to make a warlike statement, but all he asked was that they keep the freed foreign workers from stealing his chickens. And this is Larry Lasser returning you now to Admiral in New York.
President Truman is now on his way to Washington to take up the many problems facing him. For a review of what our new president can list among his first problems, we take you to Washington. Bob Evans reporting.
Here in Washington, Lafayette Park, across from the White House, and Constitution and Pennsylvania avenues are virtually deserted today. Light showers and gray skies have settled over this capital, which still mourns the death of President Roosevelt. Church services are again being held in his memory. And at the Lincoln Museum on 10th Street, a joint memorial service is to be held at 3 o'clock to honor both presidents, Roosevelt and Lincoln. The martyred Lincoln died just 80 years ago today. With the late President Roosevelt now buried in the soil of Hyde Park, the eyes of the world turn to the future and to President Harry S. Truman, already aboard the Hyde Park special train, returning to this capital. On the shoulders of this 60-year-old Missourian, he will be 61 on May 8th, now rests the big job of winning the peace. Peace not only on the international front, but on the domestic front as well. How will he measure up? Friends of President Truman, and he has many, Republicans and Democrats alike, refer to him as a practical American. And as an example of the esteem in which he is held, Senator Homer Ferguson, a Republican of Michigan, says, as soon as the people realize his capabilities, they will rally behind him. Mr. Ferguson is a member of the War Investigating Committee, which Mr. Truman headed as a senator. To be described as a practical American these days is an accolade of no mean distinction. After all, practical Americans made this country great, and practical Americans are winning the war. President Truman already has displayed his practicality by prevailing upon Joseph Stalin to send his ace diplomat, Foreign Commissar Molotov, to the San Francisco conference. Mr. Truman doesn't want the importance of the meeting minimized, as it may have been without top men from all nations. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden is here to represent Britain. Mr. Truman also has shown his practicality by making moves toward getting along well with Congress. He set a precedent by taking luncheon at the Capitol Friday. It is expected that he will build up an even closer liaison when he addresses a joint meeting of Congress at 1 tomorrow afternoon, an address which will be broadcast by CBS. And when he holds his first news conference Tuesday morning, it is believed he will firmly establish his practicality in the minds of newsmen, readers, and listeners alike. When the time comes, which will not be far away now, for President Truman to appoint department heads and make cabinet changes, it is expected that he will place a high premium on men who can get along with Congress, and he will accept the advice of Congress in making his appointments. His first opportunity to put this plan into practice may come when Mr. Truman names a federal loan administrator, a post now vacant. It is a little early to predict cabinet changes, but it does seem clear that intimates of President Roosevelt, such as Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau and Attorney General Francis Biddle, would be permitted to resign if they show a desire to do so. It seems a foregone conclusion that Secretaries of War and Navy, Stimson and Forrestal, will stay on until war's end. Also, Interior Secretary Ickes, who was a favorite of President Truman when he was a senator. Secretary of Labor Perkins may resign, as she has long wanted to do. And after San Francisco, Secretary of State Stettinius may go, with strong possibility he will be succeeded by former Assistant President James F. Burns. Mr. Burns accompanied President Truman to Hyde Park at the President's request. Mr. Burns took along notes he had prepared at Yalta. There is a feeling here in Washington that Henry Wallace may stay on as Secretary of Commerce. His removal would be at the cost of liberal and labor support. Frank Walker may go as Postmaster General, with Robert Hannigan a possible successor, and Claude Wickard may leave the Department of Agriculture, with the War Food Administration to be brought back into the agricultural fold. Indications also are that many of President Roosevelt's so-called little cabinet, including Harry Hopkins, may be permitted to withdraw. Now back to CBS in New York.
The president has been buried. The simple service at his home in the field above the Hudson symbolizes the end of these tragic 4 days. There's no need to say that the final service is not the end of Franklin Roosevelt here on Earth. He did not leave on Thursday at Warm Springs, and he did not leave this Sunday at Hyde Park. It was not in his power to remain in life any longer, and it was not in his power to depart from the living. Only the living can decide whether he is to stay or to go, and the living made that decision long ago. When the people called upon him to lead, it was then that he abandoned his own personal life and lived in the hearts and minds of millions in America and even more millions on the other side of our frontiers. His personal life was sacrificed long before that Thursday afternoon, but he will live among those who called him friend as long as the people have life. The vast grief that has gripped the people of this nation and its friends abroad is a tremendous tribute to the President, and it is also a tremendous tribute to the people. Burial is a final act, and yet the service above the Hudson is final in only one sense. It was the ending of the 4 days of grief and shock. Since that Thursday afternoon, the nation and its friends abroad have been like one stricken family. There were things to do, prayers to be spoken, and music to be played. The drums had to be muffled, the flowers gathered, and the fresh spring earth turned. From Thursday to Sunday was a time devoted to the last services that can be given to a friend who is dead. Now that time is over. There are no more vigils to be kept beside the railroad tracks, no more bells to be tolled. It is not the end, but it is as if an interval were finished. On Thursday afternoon, what the world learned was that a journey had to be made from Warm Springs through Washington to Hyde Park, from the rough battleground of practical affairs to the secure place which history has been holding open for Franklin Roosevelt. It is often said that the greatness of great men is not perceived until they are dead. Obviously, that is a belief that is false as often as true. But it is true that greatness is not mortal. The qualities which the great have to give, they give perpetually. Their gifts are taken into the pattern of life, and they appear thereafter in the fabric of the lives of nations, renewing themselves as the leaves on the trees are renewed by the seasons. In times of strain, all nations turn to the great men in their past and the people who made them great. This gigantic war has been fought by millions, living, supported by those who lived generations ago and who, in their turn, had fought for the same ends. Franklin Roosevelt has now joined those who helped to make the traditions and those who are traditions. Everywhere these last 4 days, men have been eager to do the things men must do for a friend in the interval between death and burial. The flags have been lowered and the photographs draped in black. The people have stood quietly at home and have wept publicly as well as in private. All this was proper in the appropriate time, and the appropriate time is now done. The interval is completed, and the President has reached the goal which destiny reserved for him and which the people willed that he should reach. Now it is for the living to think again of goals, the goals that lie within the reach of the living. Even in the midst of mourning, during the 4 days of sorrow, much has been said of the kind of memorial Franklin Roosevelt would like. There is little disagreement. All who have given thought to the monument that would be most fitting are agreed that the unfinished work must be completed, the victory won, the enemy defeated, and the enemy's power to threaten the free world destroyed totally. Often it has been said and written since Thursday that the conference at San Francisco must be worked out to a thoroughly successful end. Franklin Roosevelt's memorial is to be the organization of nations to preserve the peace the nations are now winning. There is, I think, a simpler way of saying the same thing. Franklin Roosevelt made friends. He had more of them than any other man. He made friends of whole nations of people. They were friends of his, and they are friends of ours. He worked unceasingly to unite this nation in the face of danger. And when the American people came together to fight off the enemy, we discovered that we were not alone. The unity had spread, and there were many nations of friends united in the same struggle. Since Thursday, the people of the United Nations have been united in grief. That they remain united in friendship, hope, and determination is all that any man, living or dead, would ask.
World News Today is brought to you each Sunday by Admiral Corporation. Listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave radio direct from the leading news centers of the world. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
This is the WBBM Air Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago.
World News Today, brought to you by Admiral Corporation, the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonographs with automatic record changers. This program is presented in behalf of Admiral dealers all over America. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations and leading news centers in our own country, CBS reporters are waiting to bring you first-hand news from the world's political and battlefronts. Now, here's Robert Trout.
This is the Day of Prayer, a national day of thanksgiving in the United States and Great Britain. President Truman attended services in Washington, and in London, the King and Queen drove to St. Paul's Cathedral in the first royal procession since the war began. Prime Minister Winston Churchill is preparing to broadcast his review of the war and his 5 years in office. The broadcast on Columbia begins half an hour from now at 3 p.m. Eastern Wartime. In the Pacific, the Tokyo radio says the Japanese home island of Kyushu is being attacked by 900 carrier planes and also by a small force of B-29s. There is no word yet from Allied sources of this enemy-reported carrier attack on Japan, but Tokyo is adding details and says the Japanese planes have found the task force from which the 900 planes were launched, some 220 miles off the southern tip of the southernmost Japanese home island. On Okinawa, the Marines are reported to be slowly smashing their way into Amike, a suburb of the island's capital, Naha. But front correspondents reporting this advance warn us that Naha itself may not fall before at least several days more of this hard street fighting with grenades and flamethrowers. There is also hard fighting on the bypassed island of New Guinea, where Australian troops led by tanks have seized the Wewak airfield and are pushing on to the town of Wewak, the last major Japanese stronghold in northeastern New Guinea. In the Philippines, 2 American divisions are fighting up narrow river valleys to join a 3rd division and cut the island of Mindanao in 2, but the Japanese are resisting fiercely and the American progress is very slow. Supreme Allied Headquarters in Paris says it has no confirmation of the report that Heinrich Himmler has been seized in northern Germany, but an Allied officer who has returned from the front says it's true. General Eisenhower has asked the United Nations War Crimes Commission to send 4 teams into Germany at once. Now for our first switch to a Columbia correspondent abroad, Admiral takes you to London. Douglas Edwards reporting.
The next episode in Britain's victory celebration comes less than a half hour from now when Prime Minister Churchill speaks to his home nation and the world. Columbia will broadcast the Prime Minister's address at 3 p.m. Eastern Wartime. Mr. Churchill is expected to review the war years, the years in which he led Great Britain out of sore and trying times into victory at the side of our own country in Russia. 1,500 fighters and heavy bombers of the American 8th Air Force are right now flying over southern England in a great victory salute, and also in tribute to their commander, Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, the man who first bombed Tokyo. And now for a first-hand description of that mighty aerial victory demonstration, we take you high up on a London rooftop. Edward R. Murrow reporting.
We're standing on top of a familiar roof high over London, and the reports have it that about 1,500 American bombers and fighters are now flying in tight formation somewhere over southern England. As a matter of fact, the only aircraft we have seen in the air in the course of the last minute and a half up here has been one B-17 going very low and very fast, apparently trying to join his formation. We're standing on a rooftop that was very familiar in the old days during the Blitz, and all over this city one can see the Union Jack and the Stars and Stripes standing stiff in a breeze in the cool of the Sunday evening here in London. About 15 minutes ago, we could hear the sound of this great air armada off in the distance, but at the moment it is impossible to see them. Just down to the right, I can see a Swiss flag flying, Danish. On down the way, the flag of China. Just here beside me is a huge Union Jack. They're rather soft, dark clouds being almost whipped over London this evening. And I should think that this great demonstration of American air strength is probably down somewhere near the south coast now. Off in the distance, down in that direction, I can just see the glint of the setting sun on silver wings. But there have been so many aircraft flying low over London in the course of the day that it's impossible to tell whether or not what I see is in fact part of this great aerial demonstration or whether it's just a few odd planes down there. Down in the distance, one can see the dome of St. Paul's, the evening sun glinting off it. Occasionally, one sees those dull, dark gaps in the buildings where bombs struck and where incendiaries came down. As a matter of fact, it was never planned for this great aerial demonstration to come over the center of London. They were going to swing wide of it at a distance of about 10 or 15 miles, and I think they crossed over South London just about 5 or 10 minutes before this broadcast began.
That was Edward R. Murrow in London, and now in New York, here again is Warren Sweeney.
With practically everybody collecting their favorite music on records, you'll certainly want one of the many beautiful post-war Admiral radio phonographs with automatic record changers.
I do want an automatic record changer, but I'm not very mechanical-minded. Will the Admiral be simple to operate?
Yes, it certainly will. The new Admiral automatic record changer will be so foolproof and trouble-free that it's going to set a new high in musical enjoyment. The Admiral will have only 3 moving parts. Just 3. Right there is the secret of Admiral's trouble-free operation. There just won't be anything to get out of adjustment of the new Admiral automatic changer. So, if you want a really fine radio phonograph with an automatic record changer that will give you years and years of carefree enjoyment, make yours an Admiral, America's smart set. Now, here once again is Robert Kraut.
CBS correspondent Larry LeSueur has just returned to Paris from a visit to Austria, where he spent some time with the Red Army. For his story, Admiral takes you to CBS Paris. Larry LeSueur reporting.
Yesterday, I was in Russian-occupied Austria. This isn't the first time that the Eastern influence has made its way up the fertile valley of the Danube, because in the little white villages that stud the green Austrian hills, you can see the tulip-domed minarets of ancient churches that mark the high tide of Byzantine influence in the Middle Ages. The Austrian people under Russian occupation were an expression little different from those in the American zone. It's one of resignation. But still, there are as many of the red and white flags of free Austria waving from the windows in the Russian zone as in ours. My jeep threaded its way among the abandoned German trucks that were left stranded when the German army fled panic-stricken from the Russians into our lines. A long line of Russian tanks came up and smashed and shoved them into the ditch. That was a far cry from the Russian front in 1942, when I used to see every abandoned German truck guarded like gold, and Russian salvage crews working frantically on them. The Red Army has all the equipment it needs now. But strangely enough, the only American equipment I saw, aside from a few trucks, were jeeps. The tanks were Russian-made and heavier than our own Shermans. The Russian tank men were the youngest men I've ever seen in tanks. They could scarcely be over 18. I asked one of the Russian youngsters what he thought of the Austrians. He said the Austrian people were all right, but the Austrian soldiers had acted very badly in the Ukraine. Personally, he was a little contemptuous about the way the Austrian civilians had replaced the white surrender flags with the red and white flags of free Austria a few hours after the Red Army entered. He showed me some of the Russian occupation money for Austria. It looked very much like American occupation money, and it said nothing about Russia at all, simply Allied military government. Vienna, he said, was fairly gay and not very much damaged. And as far as I could see, there were no rules against the Russians fraternizing with the Austrians. Long lines of Russian slave workers on foot and in horse-drawn carts were making their way eastward, liberated. Such a ragtag procession you never saw before. Some driving German trucks, some on bicycles, and all that was colorful and picturesque in Russia came by. Some with the slanted eyes of the East, others with the blue eyes and fair hair of the Ukraine. Unarmed and dejected, German prisoners were making their way in little bands, unguarded, to the prison cages. Russian soldiers passed them by without notice. But for me, it was hard to realize that the long war was over, because even as I watched, I saw 3 Russian refugees badly wounded when their horse-drawn cart collided with a German truck that had been purposely left behind blocking the road. It had been booby-trapped by the Germans. And this is Larry Lasser returning you now to Admiral in New York.
Next, for a summary of developments in the war against Japan, Admiral takes you to CBS San Francisco, Major George Fielding Elliott reporting.
In observing the attempts of the Japanese Air Force to interfere with the American operations on Okinawa Island, we should bear in mind the progressive decline and final death of Germany's Luftwaffe. And we should realize that much the same factors are at work against the Japanese air power. First, its industrial sources of supply are under heavy attack. Next, its outside fuel supplies have been cut off, and its internal fuel supplies, synthetic plants, and oil storage are also being hit. Finally, its planes and pilots are being destroyed in the air and on the ground on an increasing scale. When it accepts combat, it is always forced to fight greatly superior forces. It has one disadvantage which did not trouble the Luftwaffe to the same extent. It is inferior to its opponents not only in numbers, but also in quality, both of machines and personnel. The Japanese Air Force has already been reduced to the point where it cannot carry out strategic operations of any kind. It has no power to take the offensive. It can only try to counter our blows after those blows have been delivered. Its attempts to do even this are growing feebler and feebler. Obsolete planes and very hastily trained pilots are in evidence. The suicide method of attack is causing some damage to our shipping, but this is a sort of air warfare which is suicidal in more senses than one. It results in a rate of loss which no air force can endure, especially one whose production is diminishing rapidly and which, therefore, needs to conserve its strength rather than to recklessly expend it. According to available estimates, the Japanese production of aircraft has been more than cut in half since the beginning of this year by our B-29 attacks. The total now is estimated at hardly more than 1,000 a month, including trainers. And since March 18th, when the attacks on Okinawa began, the Japanese have lost more than 3,000 aircraft in this area alone, or just a little more than twice the number they produced in that period. That's a process that can't go on indefinitely. And now, here in San Francisco is George Murad, one of Columbia's news analysts, with news of the conference and a special interview.
Here at the security conference, most of the delegates are getting their first short breathing spell since the discussions opened. Anthony Eden left for Washington early this morning. His successor as chief delegate, Lord Halifax, is visiting Nevada for the weekend, and most of the rest are making a tour of the Golden Gate in lovely sunny weather. But the important story still is that American delegates seem to have found at least a compromise solution for regional security pacts, such as the Chapultepec Agreement. Under this new plan, regional groups could take action for defense in emergency, but later the World Organization would take over. Now, everyone has been wondering how this compromise would suit the Russians, with their particular interest in the Balkan Federation. Well, it seems to be all right, because the Moscow newspaper Izvestia says that the former proposals of Latin American countries to exclude their problems from the world body were a complete deviation from Dumbarton Oaks. This is especially dangerous, Izvestia said, because precisely in certain Latin American countries, for example, the Argentine, fascists are operating impudently and even enjoying special favors. So this compromise plan, which definitely subordinates the Pan-American bloc, should satisfy Russia and, in fact, block any other independent regional group which may emerge. Now, you've probably heard from most of the various interests at this conference, all except one, that quiet but all-important delegation of men who are fighting the war. To get the soldiers' viewpoint, Commander Harold Stassen has with him 2 military aides and advisors, Lieutenant Cord Meyer, Jr., a Marine veteran of the South Pacific, and Sergeant John Thompson, who fought in Normandy. And here now is Lieutenant Meyer.
In the first place, I think the American soldier, and any soldier, more deeply desires peace than the average civilian. He knows more vividly the terrible power of modern war, and he is ready, I think, to make more sacrifice, say to serve in an international police force, if one can be formed. But I think the soldier is realistic and even skeptical. He deeply desires a strong international organization, but is doubtful if the various nations are ready to take the radical steps and changes necessary.
Well, would you be more specific, Cord, say about trusteeships of Pacific Islands?
Yes, I think it's clear that the American delegation is seeking to acquire strategic Pacific islands through and under processes of international law. If we establish complete sovereignty by outright seizure, we would have no basis for complaint if other nations adopt the same policy, say Britain with regard to Hainan or Truk, or Russia in respect to Korea and Port Arthur.
And now what about regional pacts and geographical blocks?
Here again is this very strong tendency toward narrow national interests, which comes, I suppose, out of a desire for security in the most obvious, quickest way. But it seems to me a poor trade. From the viewpoint of power politics, if we sponsor a Latin American group over and above the World Organization, we encourage other nations to build regional groups that could be far more powerful than ours.
Well, Cord, what do you suppose the average soldier knows or thinks about this conference?
Well, I suppose he's confused, as most of us are, by all the oratory and side issues. But I think the soldier and all of us should know that the aims of this conference are very definitely limited. I think this conference hopes only to create some machinery through which nations can keep contact and work together to find peaceful solutions in post-war difficulties. It should be understood that Dumbarton Oaks, and no doubt this agreement, doesn't meet the basic problem of avoiding war. Dumbarton Oaks was just a small and cautious step. This, we hope, is a greater stride. As of now, the big nations retain their complete sovereignty, and through their veto power, reserve the right to exclude themselves from any decision the Security Council might take. We've got to accept this because it's all we've got. I think we should be critically aware of the limitations of this agreement we are making, but we should be determined to go on from here to a real international trust and effective peace machinery.
Well, thank you, Lieutenant Cord Meyer, Jr., who is Commander Harold Stassen's military aide and advisor to give the soldiers' viewpoint on the San Francisco Security Conference. This is George Murad in San Francisco. I return you now to Admiral in New York.
President Truman has fired the first shot in a new psychological warfare campaign against the Japanese. For details, Admiral takes you to CBS Washington, Tris Coffin reporting.
I found out this afternoon that the United States has thrown into high gear a dramatic psychological campaign against Japan. Our target is the Japanese leaders. Our purpose, to save lives and hasten the day of unconditional surrender. This campaign is no crackpot scheme. It has been okayed by such conservative-minded men as President Truman, his Chief of Staff, Admiral Leahy, Admiral King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, and Acting Secretary of State Grew. President Truman kicked off the campaign on VE Day. He read a statement to his news conference telling the Japanese just what to expect if they stayed in the war, and the terms for unconditional surrender. President Truman hammered one main point. The Japs have a choice: devastation of their country or a surrender which does not mean enslavement or extermination. As a part of the campaign, Captain Ellis N. Zacharias, for some time our naval attaché in Tokyo, will broadcast twice a week to Japan. He personally knows the enemy high command and cabinet and will speak to them in Japanese. According to those officials in Washington who have planned this strategy, there is a fair chance of dividing and weakening the Japanese command. They say there are two dominant groups in Japan: the young fanatics and the great financiers and manufacturing families. There is sufficient information in Washington to indicate the latter are even now tired of the war and afraid of its consequences. This campaign is, of course, only a part of the combined strategy and is being fit into the military and naval pattern. I return you to Admiral in New York.
Dispatches from Moscow we received here in New York tell us that the chief concern of the Russians this weekend is a quick arraignment of Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Goering, Franz von Papen, and Rudolf Hess as war criminals and a stepped-up manhunt for other missing German leaders. This is the day of prayer. On both sides of the Atlantic, the Allied peoples are giving solemn thanks for the victory. The accomplished fact of unconditional surrender is less than a week old, but already it is clear that this is a victory to be welcomed with a solemnity and sober thought. There's still shooting in parts of Europe. Militarily, this last-ditch fight of the surrounded Germans is of little or no importance. But it does have value as a symbol of the way in which defeat has come to Germany and the manner in which Germany is accepting it. The truth is that in 1945, the mood of defeated Germany in many ways bears an ominous similarity to the mood of defeated Germany in 1918. On the part of the German leaders, there is the same attempt to picture themselves as very decent fellows, really, who were simply doing their duty and would never willingly harm a fly. On the part of the German people, there is the same powerful impulse to ignore the fact that starting a war is a crime and to search for some excuse for the defeat. Both the leaders and the people are seeking to point the finger at someone else. It was not they, but someone else, they say, who is responsible for beginning the war and now for losing it. And it was someone else who smashed all the unwritten laws of warfare and committed atrocities of a quality and quantity unknown before this to the modern world. These German reactions to defeat might have been expected. There's been nothing in the German history of the past century which would have led us to expect anything else. But there's another tendency among the German people which, although it parallels a German mood of 1918, has caused some surprise in the Allied world. Many ordinary Germans are telling American correspondents that they no longer hold Adolf Hitler in high regard, and some German generals have issued statements implying that the German army could have won were it not for the interference of the Nazi Party. This German scorn for the Nazi Party, whether real or pretended, has astonished those Allied observers who expected the trouble in post-war Germany to come from the Nazi Party and from those Germans who refused to forsake it. But the trouble in Germany after the First World War did not come particularly from the Germans who refused to forsake the Kaiser and the form of government which he represented. There were many Germans in 1918 who were eager to announce their dislike of the imperial German government and the Kaiser, who had forgotten his dignity in his wild flight to neutral territory. Less than a week after the victory, the evidence now indicates that if the Nazi Party continues as an important force in German life, it will do so under a different name and under the guidance of different Germans. The swastika and the salute of the outstretched arm are vanishing, and no one seems more equals and officials plainly consider the old party customs and labels an embarrassing burden. And many of the ordinary German people apparently would like to forget the party that brought them so many triumphs, but failed to bring them the last victory. All this has happened before, a quarter of a century ago. And for the citizens of the United Nations, who are so from repel any further in the years to come, there is reason indeed to greet the victory with prayer and with solemn thought. And now to tell you about a post-war refrigerator with a built-in ultraviolet ray lamp to kill bacteria, here is Warren Sweeney.
It's the Admiral Sterilamp in the post-war Admiral dual-temp refrigerator. Low temperature alone cannot always prevent food from spoiling. Mold and gradual decay are proof that bacteria are present. But in the Admiral Dual Temp, the scientific protection produced by Admiral Sterilamp will destroy bacteria on exposed food surfaces and in the surrounding air. Foods will stay fresh and wholesome for a longer period. The ultraviolet rays from the Admiral Sterilamp are as safe as sunshine. Their sanitizing action retards mold growth, reduces spoilage due to bacteria, and combats odors. You'll find this Admiral Sterilamp only in the post-war Admiral Dual Temp, the refrigerator that is really two refrigerators in one. First, the built-in freezing locker in the Admiral Dual Temp will actually quick freeze foods or store frozen foods safely for months. Then, there's the extra-large purified moist cold compartment with Admiral Sterilamp protection. In this compartment, foods will stay fresh and moist in uncovered dishes, and it never has to be defrosted. Yes, the successor to the ordinary mechanical refrigerator will certainly be Dual Temp by Admiral. Even to the millions of servicemen still in Europe, and certainly to those in the Pacific, nothing is more important to their morale than mail, and lots of it. V-mail is ideal for short, frequent letters and was designed to save precious cargo space. Give your serviced man or woman a lift by writing V-mail today. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's Smart Set, and post-war makers of Admiral Dual Temp Refrigerators, Admiral Home Freezers, Admiral Electric Ranges. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave direct from leading news centers of the world. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The WBBM Air Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago.